Hello, bioethics. Welcome back. It feels good to be back giving you all a regular lecture here. Felt a little bit out of touch through the group units, viewing the group videos, but also more in touch in a way because I got to work with you all in smaller groups, which was also rewarding in its own way. Today I'll be lecturing on is there a right to healthcare? And you might notice that the format looks a little bit different. That's because my computer is not working, my school computer. So I'm having to make alternative arrangements, and I don't have the My Media Site software at my fingertips. So I'll be giving this lecture from a slide, but you won't be seeing the slide up on the screen in the video. But I will post a PowerPoint with all the slides in them, so I recommend that you pull up the PowerPoint now so you can follow along on the slides as I give the lecture, and that will help clarify, and then you'll have the PowerPoint still to come back to at your convenience. So a few things to note before we get started. One is that you have papers coming up due on October 25th, which is the end of this coming week, at 9 p.m. I'm looking forward to reading your papers. I haven't heard much from many of you apart from your group videos, so I'm excited to see how you've been taking in the class and understanding the material and what kinds of insights you have about different connections that you've discovered between different aspects of the class, which is what the paper is about. If you have questions about the paper, you should watch the video about the paper assignment, which is on the Moodle page under paper assignment section, and also read the syllabus because all the instructions are in there. And the other thing I wanted to mention is a shout out to group 7, who I think made the best video in the class with the toughest article to read. So that was very reassuring for me. It made me feel like this is a great assignment and I should keep it in, even though there are definitely some drawbacks to structuring the course this way. And I sent out a survey, speaking of drawbacks and reasons to keep the class structured the same way. I sent out a survey because I'd like your feedback about the group project and how the class is structured as I think about how to design the class in the future and make any changes for this semester also. So those are some preliminary notes, and the last preliminary note is, how is everyone doing? That's a question, not really something to note, but I want to know how you're all doing. So please comment in the video. I say that a lot, and people don't usually comment, but occasionally somebody does, and that makes my day more exciting. But I really would like to know how everyone's doing and how you're surviving this crazy time. And if you're graduating or going on to continue studying in the spring, if your living situation is changing, if anyone you know has become ill, or if you've gotten COVID yourself. I've had several students who have tested positive who have let me know that. Um, so let us know how you're doing. There are a number of ways to communicate. Okay, diving right into this lecture, the question that we're asking this week is healthcare a human right? So we have two different articles on this matter. One by somebody named Gawande. I'm not sure if I am pronouncing their name correctly, but that's from the New Yorker. And an essay by Daniels from Bioethics Anthology about the basis of a right to healthcare. So they both note near the beginning of their pieces that in every other advanced democracy there is a right to healthcare, which means there is acknowledged a right to healthcare. The United States is alone in failing to come to an answer on this question. So that's one important thing that they both sort of say up front. The fact that we're even discussing this is kind of, is an anomaly among advanced democracies. Another thing that they both do is acknowledge that granting a right to healthcare leaves room for a lot of different kinds of systems. So they give some examples. There are systems where the government provides all the services. So if you go to the doctor, you'll actually be going into a government-owned facility with people who are paid by the government, like in a school. And other Options include where the public funds insurance schemes, but the insurance companies are not run by the government. And there's various mixtures of public and private insurance schemes that still grant a right to health care to every citizen in the country. Okay, so I want to start with the Daniels piece because I think the other one is more interesting, so I want to save that for last. Not more interesting, but just more relatable. So I want to start with the Daniels piece. And Daniels starts out by talking about moral versus legal rights. So he says, if we were not recognizing any kind of moral rights, if we didn't think there were moral rights on various views, the very existence of any moral rights whatsoever is called into question. If you thought there are only legal rights, that is what we're entitled to by law, you could still say, well, this point that we just made, in every advanced democracy, there's a legal right to healthcare. It's acknowledged legally. But the question really that we want to explore is whether we can ground those legal rights in a moral right. And Daniels thinks that we can. Another distinction he draws is between positive and negative rights. So positive rights are rights that require other people to do something to preserve them. So if you have a right to education, that's a positive right because in order to have that right protected, you need other people to do stuff like run schools and teach you as you grow up to educate you. So that's why it's a positive right, because it entails a duty, an obligation on other people to support the protection of that right, to guarantee the protection of that right. They have to do something to ensure that your right is protected. Negative rights, on the other hand, are rights that you are protected when people refrain from doing something. So if you have a right not to be harmed, then that just means that other people have to refrain from harming you. So that's the very general picture of the difference between positive and negative rights. What Daniels points out is that healthcare is a positive right, and that makes it more difficult to defend it on the one hand, and it also means, like we just said, for positive rights, that other people have duties to protect your right if healthcare is a positive right. So conceiving of healthcare as a positive right, Daniels thinks, makes it more difficult to defend that right, and it also entails that other people have duties to protect your right to healthcare, if there is such a thing. So some of those examples of duties are to make sure that there are adequate resources allocated toward your healthcare and to provide a just sort of distribution of resources when they're limited. So to decide fairly how to distribute limited resources and when to give money towards education and when to give it towards healthcare, and etc. So to do that fairly and justly if you have a right to healthcare. So these are some of the duties that others have. If you have a right to healthcare, others have these obligations. Others, meaning society in general, has this obligation to make sure that your right is met, and they have to take these steps to ensure that. That is society as a whole. So the question that Daniels asks at the outset of this essay is, what is the basis and scope of a moral right to healthcare? So how can we establish a right to healthcare, and how far would that right extend? What would that guarantee specifically? And so he says, well, in order to understand the basis for a right to healthcare, we just look at moral theories of justice, to see what different moral theories would say about a right to healthcare. And he starts out with libertarianism, and he says libertarians are not going to be very friendly to a right to healthcare because they might view that as conflicting with what they see as more basic and more essential, which is people's rights to liberty and property. So the idea here is that if you're a libertarian, you probably won't grant others a right to healthcare because you don't want to have to give up some of your income and your property, things that you've earned in our society, to support that right to other people's healthcare. So like we said, if you have a right to healthcare, it's a positive right, which means other people have to do stuff to protect it. And if you're a libertarian, you might think, well, people's freedom is more important. People's freedom to do what they want with what they have is more important than your right to have your healthcare needs met. Something like that is the libertarian picture that Daniels presents. Another theory of justice that Daniels looks to is utilitarianism. And he points out in discussing utilitarianism, so think back to our discussion of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is the idea that what we should do is whatever is going to promote the most happiness for the greatest number. And he says, well, on the face of it, it seems like there are good utilitarian reasons to grant a right to health care. It reduces suffering. If people get diseases and they can get health care to cure their diseases, then they'll suffer less. And it increases the aggregate welfare. It increases welfare overall because when people have a right to health care, you're helping them reduce the impact that disease and disability have on their lives. So that's a good thing. It makes people happier overall. And so it seems like utilitarians should support the right to health care. But he points out it's not so clear cut, because on the utilitarian view, you're going to get into these kind of counterintuitive implications. So one example is that some services aren't cost beneficial. That means that the amount that we put into them isn't gonna result in the greatest welfare, because we could put the money somewhere else and do more good, but we might still think that the money should be spent on people's health. So one example of that he gives is long-term care, where you're helping to prolong the life of an elderly person if they have a preventable disease that you could cure. Well, it's not going to necessarily maximize utility, especially if it's a very expensive treatment. So perhaps if you're a utilitarian, you're not going to have the kind of grounding for a right to health care that we intuitively think people shouldn't just die because they're older. If we can save them, there are conflicting intuitions there. So that's what he's discussing in that section. Okay. So he says, if utilitarianism and libertarianism don't work for you, here's another option. We can look to Rawls's theory of justice as fairness, which views the right to health care as a requirement of a right to equality of opportunity. So that's really the theory that he's going to be focused on in the remainder of the essays. He thinks that we can use the right to equality of opportunity as a basis for grounding a right to health care. And he's not really arguing for that, though he presents an argument for it, but his focus is not to defend that argument. His focus is to say, all right, here's a way to understand how the right to health care can be grounded in Rawls's theory of justice by grounding it in the right to equality of opportunity. And here's what sort of falls out of that view if we do that. Here's how we should approach some of the more complex questions that arise when discussing a right to health care if we understand the right to health care as based in a kind of right to equality of opportunity. Okay, so that's the most important, that's the crux of this article, is understanding, if you want to understand his method, what he's doing here, I'll say it one more time, he's trying to not necessarily to argue that a right to health care follows from a right to the equality of opportunity, but that if we understand the right to health care in that way as being grounded in the equality of opportunity, then here's some sort of a framework for thinking about the complexities of healthcare on that basis. Okay, so again, the idea of grounding a right to healthcare in a right to equality of opportunity gives us a framework for thinking through some of the more difficult questions that arise related to healthcare, and that's what he is spending the essay doing, trying to explore those deeper issues by using this theory of justice to sort of provide the context that we're thinking through these things within. Okay, so to begin with, here's the argument that people have a right to health care that's grounded in a right to equal opportunity. Okay, so he presents that argument in a paragraph on page 630. I've included it in a slide here in this PowerPoint. The first premise is people have a right to equal opportunity. The second premise is, this is at the bottom left, I believe, of page 630. The second premise is disease and disability restrict opportunities. The third premise, healthcare aims to keep people functioning as normally as possible. And so number 4, healthcare preserves equal opportunity by maintaining that normal function. And the conclusion is that people have a right to healthcare because they have a right to equal opportunity. Okay, so those are just the details of how you might ground a right to healthcare in the right to equal opportunity. And again, he's not defending that view, rather he's using that kind of basis for establishing a right to healthcare to look at further questions that arise. Okay, so one thing he points out is that on this account, if we ground the right to healthcare in the right to equal opportunity in this way, there are still limitations on what healthcare we're entitled to. So, and on the opportunities that we each have. So, one limitation is that other factors can affect our equality of opportunity. So, for instance, education, wealth distribution, other power structures in our society that we've just been talking about for 6 weeks can also affect the equality of opportunity. So having a right to healthcare isn't going to guarantee that we have equal opportunity, because there are other ways that opportunities are unequal in our society, such as these power structures, education, wealth distribution, etc. And another limitation on this account is that our talents and skills are just naturally different. They vary. So some people are smarter than other people, and some people are more talented at music than other people. And we just have a variety of skills and strengths and shortcomings, and that means that those might impact our opportunities. So these are just 2 examples of limitations that prevent us from having equal opportunities. One is the social factors that are not related to healthcare. Well, they are related because we just spent 6 weeks talking about how they're related. But besides healthcare, these other factors, such as education and wealth distribution, are one kind of limitation on our ability to establish equality of opportunity. And just the natural differences that arise in our talents and skills is another limitation on our ability to all have equal opportunities. Okay, so he says, well, some versions of a right to healthcare are going to try to undo those limitations further, to say, you know, if you want to be as good at running as somebody who runs professionally, then you should be able to access the kind of skill-enhancing medical treatments that you need to be a good runner, such as hormones or whatever kinds of drugs you take to run better. I don't know what I'm talking about here, clearly. But Daniel's point is that we don't need to take that sort of expansive view of what healthcare entitlements you have, right? We can rest content with those limitations and say these limitations are outside of what healthcare should seek to remedy, and we're basing this account on the idea that we have a right to restore our normal functioning through healthcare, not to sort of enhance our functioning so that we can be all run races as fast as professional runners. Okay, so that's the sense in which Daniels is saying we should accept these limitations. We don't need this expansive account. Just because you have a right to healthcare doesn't mean you have a right to everything that you need to become a good runner, or cosmetic surgeries that will enhance your looks. What we're talking about here is a right to healthcare that will restore your normal functioning if that is impacted by disease or disability. Okay, so that's what he's exploring now, is that account of a right to healthcare based in a right to equal opportunity that accepts certain limitations on how equal we can all become. Okay, so one thing he's going to point out from the get-go, well, I guess we're way past the get-go. But one thing he points out is that not all healthcare needs count as entitlements. So just, this is related to the point I just made, not everything, not all healthcare is something that you're going to be entitled to just because you have a right to healthcare generally. And what counts as an entitlement versus things that you're not entitled to. So just because you have a right to healthcare doesn't mean you're entitled to every medical service that you want. How we decide what you are entitled to because of your right to healthcare is going to be, on this view, system relative. What that means is that it's going to depend on things like the availability of resources, our most recent technological capabilities, and other needs. So if we as a society have limited resources and we have to put some of our money collectively towards education or somewhere else, that's going to reduce the kinds of healthcare that you are entitled to. Okay, so we're starting with this idea that we have an equal, we have a right to healthcare because we want to make sure everybody in our society has equal opportunities, but then what particular types of healthcare you're entitled to, he's saying, is system relative in the sense that it's going to depend on other factors like how much money we have at our disposal as a society, and how our tax scheme is structured, and what kinds of technology we have, and what other compelling uses of our money there are that would benefit others also. So just because you have a right to healthcare doesn't mean that you have a right to any kind of healthcare, any kind of medical need that you want fulfilled, and but you do have a right to some kinds of healthcare, and just what you have a right to depends on other factors in the context. Okay, so as some examples, he's going to say cosmetic surgery, ability enhancement, like I was talking about, running super fast, experimental treatments that aren't known to be effective cures aren't necessarily going to count, okay, aren't going to count as entitlements. So these are things that you don't have a right to necessarily just because you have a right to health care. Other types of healthcare are going to count as things you have a right to. Specifically, he gives the example of reducing the impact of disease and disability on your normal functioning. Okay, that's what the whole account is based on, and that's how we know which types of healthcare count as entitlements. Well, these do. These forms of healthcare that aim to reduce the impact of a disease or a disability when that disease or disability impacts your normal functioning. So those are going to count. So again, this argument, this framing of basing the right to healthcare on a right to equal opportunity is going to help us sort through which types of healthcare count as entitlements and which don't count as entitlements, because the way they do that is by holding up normal functioning as sort of the determining factor. Okay, so whether something, a particular kind of healthcare, counts as something you have a right to depends on whether it's helping you restore normal functioning, which is going to guarantee your right to equal opportunity. Okay, so hopefully this is becoming clearer now. I think the article itself was a little bit hard to read and hard to make it through. So hopefully I'm helping you understand what's going on here. Okay, so let me just take stock of what we've just done. So he's giving this account by which we're basing the right to healthcare on a right to equal opportunity. And then he's saying that that kind of framework is going to help us determine, it's going to help us think through which kinds of healthcare, which types of services are entitlements. Are we entitled to if we have a right to healthcare? And he starts out by saying we're not entitled to all kinds of services. We're only entitled to some services. And which services those are depends, because of the account that I'm framing this by, according to him, because of the framework that we're working within, which services count as entitlements depends on whether they're helping us to restore normal functioning. And the reason that is because normal functioning is how we've grounded this right to health care. Normal functioning is what guarantees our right to equal opportunity. Okay, so try to explain this to someone else. It will help you understand it, or explain it in the mirror, or explain it to a friend from a safe social distance. Okay, but he also points out there are hard cases here. So again, we're talking about which services are going to count as entitlements. And he says cosmetic surgery, ability enhancement, those things don't count. Curing disease, if you have a disease that impacts your ability to function normally, that does count. Well, here are some hard cases: abortion, reproductive technology, growth hormones. Okay, and he elaborates on each of those examples and why they are a difficult case. Okay, it's not clear, and it's not clear what the equal opportunity view of a right to health care is going to say about these hard cases. But they are going to say, it depends on whether these things are required for normal functioning, and where that's a difficult thing to decide, he says, well, we need fair decision-making procedures to determine the outcomes in difficult cases. Okay, so he's giving us an account of the right to health care based on a right to equal opportunity that he thinks helps us sort through some of the complexities that arise when discussing a right to health care, like which services particularly are you entitled to, but he is admitting that it's going to leave some questions unanswered. There's going to be difficult cases that this account is not going to necessarily give a clear answer about, and that's okay. We just need to make sure that we have fair ways of navigating those difficult cases, of making those decisions. Okay, another thing that he wants to discuss, and then we're going to move on from Daniels, is the existence of a tiered system. So a tiered system is where you have some basic sorts of coverage for some section of the population, and then you can sort of add on extra stuff if you have the money to pay for it. So he spends a lot of words talking about this, and the important stuff to take home is that he believes that a tiered system is going to be compatible with this framework, with basing a right to healthcare on a right to equal opportunity. It's compatible, but it doesn't require it. So the view, we can guarantee equal opportunities without a tiered system, and that's what we're basing our right to healthcare on. But it would, if we do opt for a tiered system, it's not in principle prohibited, but it would include some restrictions. And in particular, it's going to include a restriction that if you have sort of add-ons in your healthcare system where everyone has a kind of basic coverage, but then people with the money can add on things if they want them, it can't undermine the integrity of that basic system. Okay, so you can read more about how he imagines that might happen if the add-ons take away the resources that are needed to provide everyone with that basic tier, that basic system. So that's just an example of how this account is going to restrict what could happen within a tiered system. And he talks about different countries that have different versions of tiered systems, different kinds of tiered systems, and he talks about two possibilities where you have a tiered system where pretty much everyone has the same basic plan, except ultra wealthy people can add on things that they want to add on. Versus, that's one picture. Another picture is where mostly the most impoverished people have the basic plan, and pretty much everyone else gets some kind of add-on. So he thinks the first picture is preferable to the second because it would make people less resentful, for one. But he has a lot to say about that, so if you're interested in these issues, that's where to go read about them. And finally, he acknowledges at the end that, again, the view leaves a lot of unanswered questions, not just the questions of which services are we entitled to, but here's an example of an unanswered question by this framework. question that's unanswered by the framework. Is it better to provide a great benefit to a few people or a lesser benefit to a lot more people? Okay, so that's an example of a question that's just not, we're not going to get a clear answer to from this framework. But again, we just need fair decision-making processes when these questions arise in particular contexts. Okay, so that's all. As short as I could, an overview of the Daniels article. I hope you're still with me, and I hope you were able to follow along on the slides, and I hope that you will go back and consult the slides as a study guide to reviewing the article. Now I'm going to move on to the Gawande piece, which I don't have as much to say about that one, but I do have a few things. So Gawande's primary method here, I told you what Daniel's method was. It's a complicated attempt to ground a right in another right, and then see how that helps us address complex issues within healthcare. Gawande has a different approach. His approach is basically to go talk to his friends and their friends and hear their stories about their own health experiences, their experiences in healthcare, and what their views are about what kind of system we should have. And he's trying to identify some kind of overlap. That's one thing he wants to do, is try to see, well, people have a whole variety of views. Is there a place where we could come to agreement? Is there something we could agree upon? And he thinks that he has found something that we could agree upon. So first, through talking to these people and getting their stories, and he's like sitting with them in diners and old places that he used to hang out in his hometown, Athens, Ohio, he sort of comes to believe that there are two sets of values in tension. There's two values, and people sort of align themselves more on one side or the other, and that's where the tension is. And the two sets of values are, on the one hand, a desire to reward work and self-reliance and give benefits to people who deserve them, people who have worked hard to get what they have. Okay, a way of rewarding that hard work and being self-reliant, being able to take care of yourself. And on the other hand, so that's one set of values. On the other hand, the values are protecting the weak and the vulnerable. And part of what he's pointing out is that we're all at some point going to become weak and vulnerable. So how do we balance this tension between the value that we have towards hard work and self-reliance, being able to take care of yourself and work hard for what you have on the one hand, and also as a society being able to lift up those most vulnerable in our midst and protect those who need protection? Those are the conflicting values. Okay, well, one thing that's related to thinking through that conflict and that tension between those two values is this view he gives from Shu, philosopher, who is going to complicate that picture we had of positive and negative rights. So remember, positive and negative rights from Daniels. Positive rights require others to do something. Negative rights require others to refrain. The sun is moving, so open the curtain. Negative rights require others to refrain from doing something. And we gave as an example of a negative right, your right not to be harmed by other people. Well, Gawande points out, it's not so simple, because even a negative right, like the right not to be harmed, is going to require others to do stuff, not just to refrain from harming you, but it's going to require judges and police officers and others who are involved in a system that is going to be able to enforce that right of protection from harm. So that's one thing to note, is that even these positive rights, and Daniels had said healthcare is going to be more difficult to defend because it's a positive right, not a negative right. Well, Gawande is pointing out even negative rights place demands on people around us and other people in our culture. And so that's something to note as we think through how do we resolve the tension between these two values and wanting to protect people's liberty and, people's hard work and their self-reliance, and also protect those most vulnerable, well, it's not so straightforward as just believing in positive rights or negative rights and having a more difficult time trying to defend positive rights, because even the so-called negative rights are going to require that people actually do things in our society to protect those rights. So the point of that is that if you're thinking that healthcare shouldn't be a right because it's going to require us as a society to act collectively to protect each other, that's not necessarily the best reason, because surely you think that you have a right not to be harmed or not to be killed, right? But those also require us as a society to act in certain ways to protect each other and to allocate resources towards enforcing those kinds of laws that protect your right not to be harmed. So um, moving on. Okay, so Gawande also gives some history. He talks about the first healthcare entitlement, which was a Vaccine Act of 1813, which was non-controversial. It was the dispensing a smallpox vaccine, which greatly reduced the death toll from smallpox within the United States. And it was something that other countries had already done. And so we followed their lead and distributed smallpox vaccines and saved a bunch of people's lives. And then he talks about the tragic follow-up to that, which was that the wrong vaccine was handed out right in our backyard in Tarboro, North Carolina, and 10 people died, I think, and so they withdrew the smallpox vaccine, and then a whole lot more people died of smallpox. So that history is definitely related to thinking through whether healthcare is a right, and also thinking through how our current pandemic is related to thinking through healthcare as a right or not. Okay, one person Gawande talks to is somebody named Arnold, who thinks he's a worker in a water treatment plant, and he thinks that healthcare is like water or trash collection, and it's not about rights. Okay, so here we have a different way of thinking about this issue. So we started this lecture. The title of the lecture is healthcare a right? And Gawande is speaking to this person, Arnold, who says it doesn't matter. It's not about rights. Do you have a right to trash collection, right? It's silly to talk about a right to having your trash picked up, but that's not about rights. The question is it the government's role to provide it? And Arnold thinks, yes, it is. Even though we don't have a right to health care, because it's silly to talk about rights in this way, we don't have a right to trash pickup, because it's silly to talk about rights in that way, he thinks the point of the government is just to provide us with these kinds of basic services that benefit the collective. And so the government ought to provide healthcare to everyone, because that's part of what the government is there to do, is to protect us in these ways and help us get our trash taken away and have clean water and electricity and all these things. But he says if everyone gets a different deal, right? If everyone had a different trash collection deal, like you got your trash picked up only once a month and I got my trash picked up every day, right? Then sort of the whole thing would kind of break down. It wouldn't work the way it does. Part of the way it works, part of the reason it's got the sort of buy-in from everyone that it does is because everyone sort of got the same stake in it. Okay, and he points out more history that as we created things like trash services and water systems and electricity and schools, these were all taken to be universal, non-controversially. We wanted everyone to have electricity and trash and water, clean water and education, and we sort of see those as collective, universal, inclusive goods. But healthcare, for some reason, was viewed as the exception, and now not everyone gets the same deal. So everyone has the same deal with water, relatively affordable, clean water. Ideally, of course, we're seeing that break down also, like in Flint and other places where the infrastructure is not able to keep up with providing everyone clean water anymore, but which is a whole issue maybe I'll talk about in the next semester when I teach this class. But the point is, the way we think about these things is sort of like, yeah, everyone should have clean water, ideally, and everyone should have electricity, and everyone should have trash collection, because if your neighbor doesn't have trash collection, it sucks for you too, right? And if your house catches fire, or your neighbor's house catches fire and there's no firefighters, then that also is going to suck for you because fire spreads. Okay, um, so for some reason we didn't view healthcare that way, even though disease, as we're seeing now with the pandemic, also spreads, right, like fires. And the problem with viewing healthcare as the exception is that not everyone gets the same deal. So Gawande also goes through some of the history and how it came to be this way and the way that healthcare policy changed during World War II. But now what we're stuck with, one of the places where everyone you talk to agrees is that the current system is sucky in a lot of ways because it depends on your job, this is a quote, your job, your state, your age, your income, your marital status, gender, medical history, not to mention your ability to read fine print. Okay, so we have this sort of piecemeal healthcare system where not everyone's getting the same deal. Everyone has different premiums and different deductibles and different access when they get sick. Okay, and part of the reason this is, he says, is due to a deep kind of mistrust that we have in our society that if I pay more and receive less, so if my premium goes up and I get fewer benefits, then we lack, as a collective, we lack the trust that there's some good to come from that it's for the greater good. And he talks to this 8th grade teacher who says this is really set in early because already by 8th grade, you have differences in how people are treated in their classes and who has potential for achieving greatness and who's sort of kicked to the curb. And so it starts early with people who are in the majority being sort of forgotten and left out and not being sort of encouraged and sent to college, who think, you know, don't have buy-in for the system. Okay, and that's part of why we have the state of health insurance and healthcare that we do. Gawande thinks ultimately progress is going to depend on whether we can, this is another quote, whether we can build and sustain the belief that collective action genuinely results in collective benefit. Okay, so that's the buy-in that he thinks we need in order to get everyone health care. That's my dog. I'm almost done. We have 2 more slides, 3 more slides. And I'll let my dog out. Okay, let me repeat that quote. Progress ultimately depends on whether we can build and sustain the belief that collective action genuinely results in collective benefit. Okay, so again, he's got this idea that we're sort of we lose trust in the system early on, and then it feels like if my premium goes up and I don't get a better benefit, then screw the whole system, right? It's not like there's going to be some greater good to come from that, is the attitude that a lot of Americans have, according to Gawande. But he's saying our progress, being able to take care of everyone in our society, is going to require that we rebuild that trust and come to believe as a culture that we, when we are asked to step up in this way by having a duty to allocate resources collectively and to give up some of our own resources to protect people's basic welfare through healthcare, we must believe that there's some greater benefit to that as a culture. And that's how we're going to get out of this terrible health system that we have and build a better one, according to Gawande. Okay, so I want to leave you with 3 separate questions, which are all on slides in this PowerPoint. So the first question is, how does the pandemic affect the right to healthcare, or affect your view on the right to healthcare? Has it changed how you feel about healthcare, and does it change whether we're entitled to healthcare, or does it highlight whether anything about that question? Does it sort of show that question in a different light, according to you? The next question is related to the last 6 weeks and the videos that you created as a group and the readings that we've been doing. So how do systems of power, which each of those weeks, that's what we've been talking about, systems of power. So we talk about race, gender, age, 3 different systems of power where some people have power over other people. those are examples of existing inequalities. So that's what we've been discussing for the last 6 weeks. How do those affect the right to health care? Okay, this is related to Daniels, who said basing the right to health care in a right to equal opportunity is still going to have limitations because there are still further inequalities of opportunity that healthcare won't address. But my question is, how are those related, right? Those existing inequalities, and I'm talking specifically about structural social inequalities that are a result of human actions and decisions. How are those inequalities related to healthcare? And in response to that question, you should think about things like the article in the New York Times about Black women giving birth and the stories that were contained there. You should think about different rates of COVID-19 within different communities, specifically people of color, and how COVID-19 affects women differently than men. These are all things we've been reading about, and so one question is, how do those differences and inequalities affect the question of the right to health care? And the last question I want to leave you with is, what kind of insurance do you have? What's your healthcare like? What's your healthcare access like? Do you have stories to share? Are there ways in which you wish that your own healthcare access, your own insurance, maybe you're on your parents' insurance, do you wish it were different? Do you wish your coverage were different? Have you had stress or problems due to inadequate health coverage? Have you had disease or disability that has impacted your coverage? In general, just what's your relationship with health insurance and the medical system, and what do you think of it? That's my last question. So I hope that you'll answer some of those questions in the discussion forum or in the comments to these videos, or just with people you live with or with your group mates, because you can still talk to your group mates even though your group project is done. And good luck writing your papers. Let me know if you need help with that. And that brings us to the end of today's lecture.